got one of the people at the forefront of the continuing movement within Europe to completely halt all forms of medical research experimentation on animals. He is veterinarian Dr. Andre Menache, and he's director of Antidote-Europe. Hi, Andre. Thanks for joining us. There is certainly some forward motion being gained. So tell us where we're at in terms of this.
Okay, I think it's important to note there are two debates happening at the moment in Europe and indeed in the rest of the world. There's first of all the ethical debate. In other words, should we be experimenting on animals? Because obviously they suffer and they die. And then there's a scientific debate. Does animal experimentation actually work? The European Union has enabled EU citizens to take part in a democratic tool called the European Citizens Initiative. Several groups within the European Union got together and decided to have a go at this. And they succeeded in raising over 1 million signatures, which meant that the European Commission had to invite them to the European Parliament to allow them to present their case. Now, just to give you an idea of how difficult it is to get 1 million signatures, there have been around 50 European Citizens Initiatives which have been presented to the European Union. Of those 50 or so, only 30 were actually registered, and of the 30 that were registered, only 3 ticked all the boxes and managed to be auditioned in the European Parliament. The one is called Right to Water, the other one is called One of Us, and Stop Vivisection was the one that we were involved in. Now, I'm very sad to say that the European Commission didn't accept any of our proposals at all. They turned down every single one of them. However, the positive side of it is that at least 1 million EU citizens are now aware of the fact that the debate surrounding animal experiments is not only about animal suffering and about ethics, it's also about the very negative impact that animal testing has on human health and on public health policies that are based on animal testing.
Andre, encouraging as that is, 1 million signatures means that there are 499 million other people who haven't put their signature to it. And this is why, this is the point that makes me feel that awareness is what it's about. Because I do believe that generally people who live in the sort of society within which we live are animal lovers. And if we're talking about the ethics of animal experimentation as regards to the welfare of the animal, if those people had the information at their fingertips that you have, many of them would make different choices.
They absolutely would. And by the way, that 1 million, those 1 million signatures represent probably about 5 million, because the conditions, the amount of personal and private information required by people signing the ECI, the European Citizens Initiative, required, date of birth, name, address, ID number, which put a lot of people off. So my feeling is that it's probably more around 5 million. And dare I say that I suggested to the European Commission that they should reward organizations that reach the 1 million mark by offering them an EU referendum. And there I think that the public would respond as they do. Just to give you one example, the European Commission funded a survey to ask the European population what they thought about funding fundamental research. Now, fundamental research, or basic research as it's also called, is curiosity-driven research. In other words, it's scientific curiosity. So the European Commission funded this poll, and they asked the public, the EU citizens, what is your feeling about you funding, in other words, we using your money, public money, to fund this sort of curiosity-driven research? Now, 68% said no. So to me, that is a very, very clear majority. Unfortunately, the results of that survey are sitting on some shelf somewhere and have not been translated into political action. So I think, yes, once people know about what's happening, there's going to be a tsunami of public opinion against animal testing and animal research. And actually, about half of all the animal research taking place in the EU today falls under the banner of fundamental research.
Now, this research is carried out because it garners, I suppose, awards for research projects, funding, it keeps people in work. Am I being too straightforward there?
No, you're being very honest there. Sadly, there are many, many university lecturers and professors who have built entire careers on just this sort of curiosity-driven research, and they've published papers for 15, 20, 25 years on the back of animals. Obviously, some of this research is very cruel. Some of it I would classify as torture, because some of these scientists are very ingenious in finding ways to cause unavoidable pain and stress to animals in the name, supposedly, of medical progress. So there's that question, first of all. There are two aspects to this. The first aspect is, but aren't these experiments being vetted by ethical committees? Well, indeed they are, but if you look at the composition of ethical committees, and indeed I have been part of ethical committees, we are way in the minority, so we'll always lose the vote. And secondly, our hands are tied because the directive, the legislation governing animal experimentation, which is called Directive 2010, simply allows scientists to conduct basic research without them having to show that their animal model, the animal they're using, is actually going to predict what will happen in a human. So they've actually got a blank check in doing this sort of animal research. And unfortunately, this sort of curiosity-driven research is not only allowed, it's encouraged, and it's funded with our public money.
I remember when I interviewed Dr. Ray Greek, who's another of the leading voices alongside you, and I was touched, moved, saddened to realise that his field of expertise is anesthesiology, is pain management, and suddenly the point of somebody who is an expert in anesthesiology being so vociferous about animal welfare as regards these animal experimentations led me to understand that there is a huge amount of pain suffered by these creatures.
There is indeed, and if one has access to the medical literature and the scientific literature, there's an awful lot of that sort of research going on. Some people will say, yes, but this might lead to a breakthrough. We might find a cure for cancer. Well, I'm afraid all the scientific evidence is on our side, in the sense that no. If you look at the sort of reviews that have been conducted, very few reviews, because sadly, scientists don't like to audit themselves. They like to have, as I said, a blank check and just, go out there and ask these open-ended questions, and hey, you never know, once in a million you might find the cure for cancer. Well, actually, all the science says that isn't going to happen. And the sort of statistics that we're looking at, a scientific paper, which looked at 25,000 articles involving basic research, most of them using animals, and saying, yes, this sort of basic research is going to somehow lead to clinical application. Well, actually, when the 25,000 articles were actually looked in detail, the success rate of actually some basic research finding using animals leading to a clinical application was in the order of 0.004%. Now, if the public knew that, there would be a revolution, there would be a revolt. But it's very difficult to get this sort of information across to the general public. It's equally difficult to get across to members of parliament, because most members of parliament have no science background. Very, very few have any understanding of biology, etc. So that makes, I would say, our biggest hurdle today is not the technology. It's not the replacing of animals with modern technology, because that we could do. The hardest part of this debate is actually communication. How do you communicate a very complex message to the masses and to the policymakers? Most of them understand economics. So if we could sort of translate the debate into economics and say, this is how much money animal experimentation is costing the taxpayer. This is how much money bad health and failed health policies based on animal data and pollution and environmental control, this is how much it's costing the population. If we could sort of put those figures together, and it's not easy, then some politicians might start to understand the message.
So we can look at that from the economic perspective. We can look at it also from the perspective of the ethics around the suffering of animals. But moreover, Andre, there must be a case to suggest that the medical advancement in medical treatments will have been held back by so much emphasis on a form of research which you can clearly state is not productive.
Okay, again, we come back to this question, this problem of how do you communicate this very complex and detailed history of medical discoveries. As I say, that if you look at the evidence, it's all in our favor. But no politician is going to look at a 20-page scientific article that explains that actually people with heart problems did not depend on animal experimentation. So again, we come back to this fundamental problem, and unfortunately, who is benefiting from this are the animal researchers, because they have succeeded in maintaining this debate on a very, very superficial level. Just as an example, if people like Dr. Ray Greek and myself are given 2 minutes on public television versus an animal researcher, well, the animal researcher in 2 minutes will say, well, if it wasn't for animal experiments, we wouldn't have heart transplants, vaccines, antibiotics. He's done the job. She has made their point, and a 10-year-old child can understand that, and all the politicians can understand that. Dr. Ray Greek and I, in 10 minutes or 2 minutes, cannot undo that. And that is our biggest problem. And this is what we asked the European Commission when the European Citizens Initiative Stop Vivisection was auditioned in the European Parliament. We said to the European Commission, let us have a public, scientific, in-depth debate with experts from both sides, not where the speakers have 10 minutes to speak, but where we have a few days, similar to a public jury or to a consensus conference. And there we will win, because there we have the evidence. But as long as the debate is kept superficial, then it's simply your grandmother or your dog. And unfortunately, that sort of emotional blackmail is what is the agenda of the day. And there isn't a week where you don't see in the newspaper, researchers claim to have found a cure for cancer using this mouse or that mouse or this monkey or that monkey. Whereas we only get an article in the conventional media about once a year. We got our message across thanks to the Stop Vivisection initiative, because there the mainstream media had no choice. They had to interview us. They had to, for the first time, listen to our boring scientific arguments. But at the end of the day, the scientific argument is what sweeps away the mantra used by animal experimenters that animal experimentation is a necessary evil. Well, what we're saying is that we have the technology to take away the necessary. So all that's left is the evil. Public opinion will not tolerate evil and will sweep it away.
Taking up a point of playing on people's sympathies, essentially on their sensibilities, making the argument subjective, because everybody knows somebody, let's say, who has suffered from cancer and perhaps perished from cancer. So immediately it's very easy for people to turn around and say, yes, but just if we do find, you never know, we might just find a cure for cancer. But the fact is that the individual person listening to this who may want to make a choice is unable to really have any impact in terms of making a choice when it comes to medication. When we saw the move to ban testing for cosmetics on animals, of course there were ways and means by which individuals could make choices when they purchase. But how do we make choices when we're being prescribed a drug?
Okay, there we have no choice, because all drugs by law must be tested on animals. And this goes back to more or less the time of the Second World War. So it was after the Nuremberg trials that the World Medical Association, the Helsinki Declaration, all those people involved in lawmaking got together and they said, look, we must test on animals before we test on people. And, 70 years ago, that might have made sense. And so they said, look, we've got to test on a rodent and a non-rodent species before we start testing on people. The rodent species is usually a rat. The non-rodent species is usually the beagle dog, sometimes a monkey. And unfortunately, we're stuck with a 70-year-old law today, which has been overtaken by science. In other words, science has moved forward by 70 years, but we're still stuck with a 70-year-old law that says you must do animal tests. Now, the pharmaceutical industry realizes that this is totally ineffective, and the pharmaceutical industry is going towards what's called personalized medicine, which is based on human DNA. So they are going in the right direction, but they can still use this law to get their products onto the market sooner rather than later, because by being allowed to use animals, they can pick and choose the species of rat or mouse that will give them the result that they want, and therefore they will get their product onto the market, or rather they will be allowed to proceed to human testing, which is called clinical trials. By the way, clinical trials sounds a lot better than human experimentation, but that's exactly what clinical trials are. And occasionally we're reminded of the risks when people are damaged in clinical trials. Yeah. So unfortunately, we're stuck with this out-of-date law, or the law needs to be changed. The industry is slow to want this law to change because they have this freedom of movement, which I'm not aware exists in any other industry, where the manufacturer is allowed to pick and choose the strain or species of animal to prove their point.
Dr. Andre Menache, we're nearly out of time, but I have kept a minute by because I'd like to ask you, as a medical doctor, how did you become so passionate about this particular issue?
Okay, so I'm a veterinarian and not a medical doctor. And the reason I got so impassioned about this is that I thought that the way to medical progress surely doesn't have to go through animal suffering. And as a vet, I wouldn't test a drug for parrots on horses, and people get that straight away. So why test drugs for people on rats? That just doesn't make sense.
Well, just incredible to listen to you. I hope the listeners have absorbed the message, which is really quite simple, that you've given us today. And I will definitely be asking to speak to you again. But thank you so much for your time today.